I really don't know how to best bridge the gap between those that play Japanese RPGs and those that don't, but I can certainly try. For many of us, the first entry into the genre ends up being our favorite. Whether or not our first JRPG is just as irresistible as a Rusalka that lures us into a lake and attempts to drown us, I don't know that either. But I will say that Final Fantasy IV was my first entry to the franchise, and it still holds a special place for me. There are two things that are quite relevant and should be acknowledged when examining Final Fantasy IV in 2018. Number one, we as consumers are currently experiencing a period where we demand realism in our forms of entertainment. And number two, games have been around long enough that many themes and tropes have been used several dozen times, to the point where predictability and disappointment quickly follow after these tropes have been experienced. With that out of the way, Final Fantasy IV really pushes a vast quantity of tropes, but they don't take away from the experience. In fact, they add to the charm. In 1991, games were still young enough to implement tropes used in written fiction without creating a feeling of exhaustion. For Final Fantasy IV, the damsel in distress, the friend that betrays you, the love triangle, the boss that just so happens to escape an epic battle before the finishing blow. The list goes on seemingly forever, but any tropes or predictable outcomes don't take away from the fun. And if the enjoyment of a bag full of tropes comes as a surprise, know also that many of us have played through this game countless times over. The original English localization of Final Fantasy IV, as it appeared in the Super Nintendo release as Final Fantasy II in the United States, was extremely simplified and contained various translation errors. The game has received numerous localization revisions over the years, but one thing remains: melodrama. Going hand in hand with the tropes that help create the game, Final Fantasy IV leans heavily upon a sensationalized delivery of dialogue to evoke an emotional response from us. A retrospective on something such as Final Fantasy IV is rather unique, as we now have over 25 years of localization revisions, be they official or fan-made, to help boost character development and further explain the events that transpire. However, I feel that Final Fantasy IV is at its best when a character is having an emotional moment while using the fewest words possible. Regardless of which English script is used, the stage-worthy, over-the-top emotions are there. And if this facet seems difficult to grasp in terms of impact on the game, consider this. If you count the number of exclamation points found in the Super Nintendo translation of the game, you'll find that there are close to 1,200 of them. The GBA version drops this number by a third, but no matter which version you play, the story demands that the characters scream in agony, anger, and despair. The storytelling may not equate to the likes of Shakespeare, but the raw, over-the-top emotions certainly try to channel the playwright, albeit with simpler dialogue. When I started Facets of the Gem, I told myself I would try my best to avoid using typical traits to describe what makes a game good: story, gameplay, graphics, music, etc. I bent the rules a bit when mentioning the art aesthetic of Another World, but I can't really talk about Final Fantasy IV, its tropes, and its melodrama without finishing off the three facets with the music. This game is at the very least a complete package of those three. I feel like if you take away the music from Final Fantasy IV, you are left with a great emptiness, a lack of cohesion as the action and story unfold. Star Wars is a great example of a fun movie that would suffer a tremendous loss if you removed or replaced the soundtrack. Final Fantasy IV is quite similar. The bombastic brass and sweeping strings boost the emotional response of the player and match the over-the-top drama of the game. I have to wonder what someone today would think of Final Fantasy IV if they played it for the first time. Is my personal enjoyment of the game based purely on nostalgia, or is it fun regardless of the era in which it was first experienced? Well, I think it is amazing, but perhaps I'm just living in a fantasy world.